The rain fell like a curtain of lead over the desolate asphalt of a secondary Texas highway, the kind of brutal storm that swallows the light and drowns all hope. The visual impact that grabs the soul is not the blinding glare of a concert stage, but the pitch-black darkness of a muddy shoulder. The high beams of a massive pickup truck cut through the thick fog, revealing a heartbreaking scene. An elderly man, soaked to his very bones, is kneeling in the freezing mud. He makes no effort to shield himself from the violent downpour. Instead, he cradles the shattered remains of an antique acoustic guitar against his chest, holding it as if he were holding a lifeless body. The emotional shock reaches its absolute peak when the heavy door of the truck swings open. Impeccable ostrich leather boots step directly into the deep puddle of mud. It is George Strait, the living legend of country music, ignoring the biting cold and his own untouchable status, walking straight into the absolute despair of a stranger to witness a quiet mourning for a broken piece of wood. Inside the cabin of that truck just moments before, the world was a sanctuary of warmth and quiet reflection. The dashboard cast a soft, amber glow over George's hands as they rested lightly on the leather steering wheel. The heater blew a steady stream of warm air, carrying the faint, familiar scent of black coffee and worn saddle leather. He was driving alone, navigating the winding backroads of Texas, seeking the profound silence that only the empty plains could offer after an exhausting, highly successful tour. The roar of 80,000 screaming fans still echoed faintly in the back of his mind, but out here under the vast and angry Texas sky, he was just a man heading back to his ranch. He craved the smell of the wet earth, the isolation of the wire fences, and the simple truth of the land. But the sky had opened up with a vengeance, unleashing a torrential downpour that forced him to slow his heavy vehicle to a crawl. The rhythmic, frantic beating of the windshield wipers was the only sound competing with the roar of the rain against the metal roof. Through the sweeping blades clearing the glass, George narrowed his eyes. The headlights caught something irregular on the side of the road, a shadow that did not belong among the mesquite bushes and barbed wire. It was a ghost of a figure, hunched and defeated. George eased his foot off the gas, the heavy tires splashing through the rising water on the asphalt. As the truck drew closer, the tragic details of the scene painted themselves in the harsh white light of the high beams. It was a man in his late 70s. He was sitting on a cardboard suitcase that was literally dissolving into pulp beneath him, the heavy rain melting away his only worldly possessions. His clothes were entirely saturated, clinging to a frail frame that shook violently with the cold. But what caught George's eye, what made the stoic cowboy instinctively reach for the hazard light switch, was what the old man held in his lap. It was a vintage Martin guitar, its beautiful mahogany body violently cracked open, the neck fractured entirely, leaving the strings tangled and twisted like rusty barbed wire. The old man's eyes were vacant, staring down at the ruined instrument with a hollow emptiness that spoke of a soul entirely drained of life. He was not waving for help. He was not looking at the road. He was simply waiting for the storm to wash him away. George pulled the heavy truck onto the muddy shoulder, the amber hazard lights beginning to pulse, casting a rhythmic, golden heartbeat into the freezing rain. He did not hesitate. He did not reach for an umbrella. He pushed the heavy door open and stepped out into the hostility of the storm. The icy water instantly soaked through his jeans, the freezing wind biting at his face, but he paid it no mind. The smell of ozone, wet asphalt, and crushed sagebrush filled the air. He walked slowly toward the old man, his boots sinking deep into the Texas mud. The old man, Arthur, was trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake, the freezing rain masking the tears that streamed down his deeply wrinkled face. Just hours ago, he had a small damp room in a forgotten boarding house. It was not much, but it kept the wind off his back. But the landlord, a man whose heart had hardened into a bitter stone, had demanded the rent Arthur did not have. Arthur had pleaded, explaining that his hands were getting too stiff to play the local diners as often as he used to, that the tips were drying up. The landlord had not just thrown Arthur into the street. He had seen the way Arthur looked at the guitar case, the way he protected it. In a moment of pure, unadulterated cruelty, the landlord had snatched the case, opened it, and stomped his heavy work boot directly through the fragile wood of the instrument. That guitar was not just wood and wire to Arthur. It was the voice of his late wife, She had saved pennies in a jar for 3 years to buy it for him on their 10th anniversary. Every scratch on its surface held a memory of a summer evening on a porch. Every worn fret was a testament to the decades of melodies they had shared. When the wood snapped beneath the landlord's boot, it sounded to Arthur like a bone breaking, like the final cord tethering him to the world snapping in two. He had gathered the pieces, packed his cardboard suitcase, and walked until his legs gave out on this desolate highway. George stood over Arthur, the water dripping heavily from the brim of his Stetson hat. He looked down at the devastating scene. Arthur did not look up. He was shivering uncontrollably, his blue lips trembling as he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the roaring storm. He was talking to the guitar, apologizing to it, apologizing to his wife. His freezing arthritic fingers clumsily tried to press the jagged splinters of the mahogany body back together. He pushed a piece of the shattered faceplate against the side, trying to make the grain match, trying to force the impossible. The wet wood slipped from his numb fingers and fell back into the thick, dark mud. Arthur let out a sound that was less of a cry and more of a dying breath. His shoulders collapsed, his chest heaving as he stared at the piece of wood sinking into the dirt. He spoke to the mud, his voice thick with absolute defeat. "The music is over. There is nothing left for me. The world has taken it all." Before we witness the incredible response of a true Texas legend, before we see how a man who has everything reacts to a man who has lost it all, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because stories of true redemption and human kindness are what keep the spirit alive. George Strait did not reach for his wallet. He knew that throwing crisp $100 bills at a man whose soul had just been crushed would be an insult to his grief. Money could buy a new guitar, but it could never buy back the history, the dignity, and the love embedded in that shattered Martin. George looked at the old man, seeing past the soaked clothes and the dirt. He saw a fellow musician, a man who understood that a guitar is an extension of the heart. Without a single word, George unbuttoned his heavy, expensive, fleece-lined ranch coat. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, letting the freezing rain hit his flannel shirt instantly. He knelt down right there in the thick, freezing mud, ruining his jeans, dirtying his boots, bringing himself down to the exact same level as the broken man. He gently draped the heavy, warm coat over Arthur's trembling shoulders. Arthur flinched slightly at the sudden warmth, his cloudy eyes slowly lifting to look at the man kneeling beside him. He did not recognize the famous face. His mind was too clouded by the cold and the trauma. He only saw a stranger with kind, steady eyes beneath the brim of a dripping hat. Then George did the unthinkable. He reached out with his large, calloused hands, hands that had strummed chords for millions, hands that had held platinum records, and he began to pick up the pieces of the broken guitar from the mud. He moved with the slow, deliberate reverence of a man handling sacred relics. He picked up the large fragments of the body, wiping the thick mud away with the sleeve of his own shirt. He searched the puddle, his fingers digging into the cold earth to retrieve every single splinter, every tuning peg, every broken piece of the bridge. He gathered them all carefully, stacking them in his arms. Arthur watched, paralyzed by the cold and the sheer disbelief of what he was witnessing. Why was this stranger digging in the mud for garbage? George stood up, holding the shattered pieces against his chest to protect them from the rain. He looked down at Arthur, offering a strong, steady hand. "Come on now, partner, let us get you out of this rain." Arthur hesitated, his stiff fingers reaching up to grasp the offered hand. George pulled the frail man up with effortless strength, supporting his weight as Arthur's legs wobbled unsteadily. George guided him toward the passenger side of the massive truck, opening the door and helping the old man climb up into the heated cabin. George walked around to the back of the truck, opened the bed cover, and pulled out a clean, thick cotton towel. He carefully, almost surgically, laid the broken pieces of the Martin guitar into the center of the towel, wrapping it up tight to protect the wet wood from any further damage. He placed the bundle gently on the back seat before climbing into the driver's side, shutting the heavy door and sealing them inside the warm, quiet sanctuary of the cabin. The contrast was immediate. The howling of the wind was muffled, replaced by the steady hum of the heater working overtime. Arthur sat shivering in the passenger seat, drowning in the oversized coat, staring blankly at the dashboard. The water dripped from his thin gray hair, pooling on the heavy rubber floor mats. George turned the heat up all the way, aiming the vents directly at the old man. He put the truck in drive, slowly pulling back onto the dark highway, leaving the dissolving cardboard suitcase behind on the shoulder. They drove in heavy silence for a long time. The only sounds were the tires cutting through the water on the road and the rhythmic beating of the wipers. George kept his eyes on the road, giving the old man the space and the quiet he needed to thaw out, both physically and emotionally. The warmth of the cabin slowly began to penetrate Arthur's soaked bones. The violent shaking subsided into a dull tremor. As the miles rolled by, George noticed the wrapped towel in the rearview mirror. He thought about the cruelty of a world that would smash a man's only source of joy. He felt a deep, righteous anger toward the unknown landlord, but he pushed it down, replacing it with the calm resolve that defined him. He knew the healing power of a melody. He knew that silence in a moment of trauma could be deafening. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, George began to hum. It was a low, resonant sound, a deep baritone vibration that seemed to fill the entire cabin. He was humming an old traditional country gospel hymn, a song about walking through the valley of shadows, a song about finding a light in the darkest of nights. The melody was simple, but carried a profound, ancient weight. Arthur's head slowly turned. He recognized the tune. It was a song his wife used to sing while she washed the dishes, a song he used to pick out on that very Martin guitar on Sunday afternoons. But it was not just the song that caught his attention, it was the voice. Even just humming, the tone was unmistakable. It was smooth, flawless, carrying the undeniable authenticity of the Texas plains. It was a voice Arthur had heard on jukeboxes in every diner he had ever played, a voice that had poured out of crackling radios for decades. Arthur stared at the profile of the man driving the truck. He looked at the strong jawline, the calm eyes fixed on the road, the way the Stetson sat on his head. The realization hit Arthur like a physical blow, cutting through the fog of his despair. His breath hitched in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice was raspy, broken from the cold and the crying. You are," Arthur stammered, his eyes widening in absolute shock. George stopped humming. He did not turn his head, keeping his eyes on the wet road ahead, but a small, gentle smile touched the corners of his mouth. He reached over and turned down the fan of the heater, just a notch. George tipped his hat slightly, a subtle gesture of pure Texas politeness. "Sir, the music does not end as long as there is someone left to remember the melody." He glanced over at the bewildered old man, his expression serious and full of a quiet, unshakable promise. "We are going to fix this." The silence that followed George's words was heavier than the storm raging outside the thick glass of the truck. Arthur sat frozen, his trembling hands clutching the edges of the oversized, fleece-lined coat that engulfed his frail frame. He stared at the man behind the wheel, his mind struggling to bridge the gap between the legendary figure he had seen on television screens and the humble, mud-stained cowboy currently navigating the treacherous, rain-slicked backroads of Texas. The heater hummed a steady, comforting tune, but the cold inside Arthur's soul was something no machine could easily thaw. He looked down at his own worn, waterlogged boots, feeling a sudden, crushing wave of shame. He was a broken man with nothing left to his name, but a pile of splintered wood wrapped in a towel on the back seat. And here he was, bleeding his misery onto the pristine floorboards of a superstar's truck. "I cannot let you do this," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking thick with a lifetime of swallowed pride and fresh grief. "You are a busy man. You have a life, a family. I am just an old fool who did not know when to pack it in. You should just drop me at the next gas station. I will figure something out, I always do." George did not immediately reply. He kept his steady gaze on the road, his strong hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The windshield wipers beat a rhythmic tempo, clearing the heavy sheets of water that tried to blind them. He let Arthur's words hang in the warm air, understanding that the old man was fighting for the last scrap of his dignity. When George finally spoke, his voice was as calm and deep as a slow-moving river. "Sir, the Lord puts us on certain roads for a reason, and he surely does not make mistakes when he sends a storm. I was driving this stretch of highway looking for some quiet, but I reckon I was supposed to find you instead. Out here in Texas, we do not leave a neighbor out in the rain, and we certainly do not abandon a fellow musician when his strings are cut. You are not going to any gas station. "You are coming home with me." Arthur squeezed his eyes shut, a single hot tear escaping and tracing a path through the grime on his weathered cheek. He took a deep, shaky breath, the smell of the rich leather and the faint aroma of George's black coffee filling his lungs. It was the smell of safety, a luxury he had not known for years. As the truck plowed through the endless night, the walls Arthur had built around his heart began to crumble. With the rhythm of the tires on the wet asphalt acting as a metronome, Arthur began to speak. He did not just tell George about the cruel landlord or the eviction, he poured out the very essence of his life. He spoke of Martha. He described the way her laughter used to fill their tiny drafty house, making it feel like a mansion. He talked about the smell of her peach cobbler baking on a Sunday afternoon, and how she had secretly saved the spare change from her waitressing job in a large glass jar hidden beneath the floorboards. For 3 years, she had saved those coins, denying herself new dresses and simple comforts, all to buy him that Martin guitar for their 10th anniversary. Arthur described the exact moment she handed him the case, the pride shining in her eyes, telling him that a man with his talent deserved an instrument that could speak the language of his soul. "When that man brought his boot down on the wood today," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a devastated whisper, "it was not just the wood breaking. I heard her voice stop. I heard the end of my life. That guitar was the only proof I had left that somebody, once upon a time, believed in me." George listened in absolute silence. He did not offer empty platitudes or generic words of comfort. He absorbed the weight of Arthur's tragedy, his jaw tightening slightly in the shadows of the cabin. He knew the sacred bond between a musician and his instrument. A guitar is not just a tool, it is a vault where a player stores his deepest sorrows, his greatest joys, and the secrets he cannot bring himself to speak aloud. To destroy that vault was a profound violation. George made a silent vow right then and there. He was not just going to repair a piece of wood, he was going to restore a man's reason to breathe. Hours passed, and the violent storm slowly exhausted itself, giving way to a gentle, steady drizzle. The dark sky began to bleed into the deep purple and bruised orange of a Texas dawn. The truck turned off the main highway, the tires crunching onto a long, winding gravel driveway, lined with ancient, sprawling oak trees. The scent of wet sagebrush, damp earth, and morning dew drifted through the air vents, signaling their arrival. The massive iron gates of George Strait's ranch stood open, welcoming them into a sprawling sanctuary of rolling green pastures and quiet, stoic grace. George parked the truck near the wraparound porch of a beautiful, understated ranch house. It was not a flashy mansion built for show, but a solid, welcoming home built of native stone and thick timber. He turned off the engine, the sudden quiet wrapping around them like a heavy blanket. George stepped out, walked around, and opened Arthur's door, helping the exhausted old man down onto the gravel. Arthur looked around, his tired eyes taking in the vastness of the land, the horses grazing peacefully in the distance, the mist rising off the wet grass. It felt like stepping into heaven after surviving a long, brutal stint in purgatory. Inside, the house was a haven of warmth. A fire had been banked in the massive stone fireplace, its glowing embers casting a soft, dancing light across the worn leather sofas and Navajo rugs. George did not call for staff. He guided Arthur to a comfortable chair near the hearth himself. He walked into the kitchen, his boots echoing softly on the hardwood floor, and returned moments later with a steaming mug of coffee and a thick, warm blanket. He placed the mug in Arthur's trembling hands and draped the blanket over his lap. "You rest here, Arthur," George said softly. "I'm going to get you some dry clothes, and then we are going to get some real food into you." While Arthur sat by the fire, the warmth slowly seeping into his aching joints, George walked out to the truck. He opened the back door and carefully lifted the heavy towel containing the shattered remains of the Martin guitar. He carried it into his private study, a room lined with gold and platinum records, framed photographs of country music legends, and walls of worn books. He cleared off his large oak desk and gently set the bundle down. Slowly, he peeled back the layers of the towel, revealing the devastating damage under the bright light of his desk lamp. It was worse than it had looked in the dark. The mahogany back was splintered into dozens of jagged pieces. The spruce top was cracked straight down the middle, and the neck was hanging by a few twisted steel strings. Most men would have looked at the pile of debris and declared it fit only for the fire. But George saw the history etched into the wood. He saw the worn fretboard where Arthur's fingers had danced for decades. He saw the faded pickguard, scratched and beaten by thousands of songs played in smoky diners and empty rooms. George picked up the heavy receiver of his desk phone and dialed a number from memory. He was calling a man in Nashville, an old reclusive master luthier who had built and repaired instruments for the greatest names in the history of music. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. George spoke in a low, serious tone, explaining the situation. He described the guitar, the damage, and the man who owned it. He made his instructions absolutely clear. "I do not want you to make it look brand new," George said, his eyes tracing the jagged edges of the broken wood. "I do not want you to sand away the scratches or replace the fretboard. That wood holds the man's whole life. I want you to put it back together. Reinforce the inside, make it structurally sound, make it sing again, but leave the scars visible. Let the cracks show where it was broken and healed. I will fly it out to you tonight on a private charter. Money is no object. Just bring her back to life." For the next several weeks, the sprawling Texas ranch became a place of profound healing for Arthur. He was given a comfortable guest room overlooking the pastures. At first, he barely spoke, his spirit still bruised and fragile. He would sit on the porch for hours, watching the sun track across the vast sky, his empty hands resting in his lap. But George was patient. He treated Arthur not as a charity case, but as an honored guest, a fellow traveler on the long, dusty road of life. They shared simple meals at the heavy wooden dining table. George would ask Arthur about the old days, about the honky-tonks he used to play, the musicians he had met, the songs he had written. Slowly, the color began to return to Arthur's cheeks. The deep, dark circles under his eyes began to fade. The fresh Texas air, the hearty meals, and the undeniable respect shown to him by the king of country music began to mend the fractured pieces of his soul. One evening, as the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson and gold, George walked out onto the porch, carrying 2 acoustic guitars. He handed one to Arthur. It was a beautiful, well-worn Gibson. Arthur hesitated, looking at his stiff, arthritic hands. He had not touched a string since the night his Martin was destroyed. "My fingers are too old, George," Arthur murmured, shaking his head slowly. "The calluses are gone. The music left me that night in the rain." George sat down in the rocking chair beside him, settling the other guitar on his knee. He looked out at the fading light, his profile sharp against the sunset. "A man's music does not live in his calluses, Arthur. It lives in his heart. The strings just give it a way out." Now I have been trying to remember the bridge to an old Hank Williams tune, and I cannot quite get my fingers around it. I reckon you know it. George began to strum a slow, mournful progression, intentionally missing a chord. Arthur watched him, a faint spark igniting in his tired eyes. The instinct of a lifetime took over. Slowly, Arthur raised the Gibson, his trembling fingers finding their places on the fretboard. He pressed down, wincing slightly at the unfamiliar bite of the steel strings, and strummed the correct chord, seamlessly filling the gap in George's melody. George smiled, a genuine, warm expression, and nodded. They sat there on the porch as the stars began to poke through the darkening sky, trading chords, sharing verses, their voices blending in the cool night air. For the first time in a very long time, Arthur felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his grief begin to lift. He was playing again. He was alive. 4 weeks to the day after the storm, a black delivery van pulled up the long gravel driveway. George walked out to meet it, signing for a large, heavy, custom-built flight case. He carried it into the house with the utmost care, his heart beating with a quiet anticipation. He found Arthur sitting by the stone fireplace, reading a worn paperback book. George set the heavy case down on the massive oak coffee table. The loud clack of the metal latches echoing in the quiet room made Arthur look up. George stepped back, gesturing to the case with a nod of his head. "I believe this belongs to you, Arthur." Arthur stood up slowly, his knees popping in the quiet room. He walked over to the table, his breath catching in his throat. He looked at George, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and impossible hope. His hands shook violently as he reached out and slowly lifted the lid of the case. The interior was lined with crushed red velvet, and resting perfectly in the center was the Martin guitar. It was a breathtaking sight. The master luthier in Nashville had performed an absolute miracle. The guitar was whole again, but it was not erased of its history. The massive cracks where the landlord's boot had shattered the mahogany were visible, filled with a specialized dark binding resin that looked like veins of deep amber running through the wood. The shattered faceplate had been meticulously pieced back together like a tragic puzzle, the scars worn proudly on its surface. It looked like a veteran returning from a brutal war, battered, scarred, but standing tall and undeniably beautiful. Arthur fell to his knees beside the coffee table. He did not touch the guitar at first. He just hovered his trembling hands over it, tears streaming freely down his face, dropping onto the red velvet. He traced the amber scars with a gentle, reverent finger. He could feel the history, the pain, and the incredible love that had put it back together. He looked up at George, his face a portrait of absolute, overwhelming gratitude. "You saved her," Arthur choked out, his chest heaving with heavy sobs. "You saved my Martha's voice. I do not know how I can ever repay you. I do not have anything to give you." George walked over and placed a strong, reassuring hand on Arthur's shaking shoulder. He looked down at the old man, his own eyes shining with unshed emotion. "You do not owe me a single thing, Arthur. That guitar was meant to be played, and your story is meant to be heard. You have got your voice back now. It is time you use it." Arthur carefully lifted the guitar from the case, cradling it against his chest, just as he had done in the freezing mud weeks ago. But this time, he was not holding a corpse. He was holding a survivor. He sat back on his heels, adjusted his grip, and strummed a single, open G chord. The sound that erupted from the wooden body was astonishing. It was rich, deep, and incredibly resonant. The structural reinforcements inside had somehow deepened the tone, giving it a powerful, haunting timbre that it had never possessed before. It sounded like a choir of angels singing through the scars of a broken heart. The melody filled the large room, vibrating through the floorboards, soaring up to the heavy timber beams of the ceiling. George watched Arthur close his eyes, losing himself in the music, the years melting away from his face as his fingers remembered their ancient dance across the frets. The king of country music knew right then that the journey was not over. Healing the guitar and healing the man were only the first steps. True redemption required a witness. True justice required the world to see the beauty that could rise from absolute ruin. George waited until Arthur finished the song, letting the final beautiful note fade into the silence of the room. He walked over, picked up his own hat from the leather sofa, and looked at the old man with a serious, fiery determination in his eyes. "Arthur," George said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise that would change history. "Get your boots on. We have got a gig to play tomorrow night, and there are about 80,000 people waiting to hear what that guitar has to say." The drive to the stadium the following afternoon was a journey through a world Arthur had long forgotten, a world of neon signs blurring past the tinted windows of a massive black luxury SUV. The sprawling concrete veins of the Texas highway system carried them toward the beating heart of the city, a stark contrast to the desolate, muddy back road where this incredible story had begun. Arthur sat in the plush leather seat, his hands resting gently on the hard shell of the custom guitar case across his lap. He was wearing a brand new, crisp white pearl snap shirt, dark indigo denim jeans that had never seen a day of hard labor, and a pair of beautifully tooled leather boots that George had personally selected for him. He looked like a distinguished gentleman of the Old West, a man of quiet dignity and profound history. But beneath the pristine clothes, his heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his ribs. He was a man who had spent his life playing for spare change in dimly lit diners, where the clatter of silverware and the hiss of deep fryers often drowned out his melodies. The concept of walking out in front of 80,000 screaming people was a mountain too steep for his tired mind to climb. He looked over at George, who was staring out the window, his profile calm and unreadable under the brim of his ever-present Stetson. The king of country music radiated an aura of absolute peace, an anchor in the middle of a swirling ocean of anticipation. George turned his head, catching the sheer panic in the old man's eyes. He offered a slow, reassuring smile. The heavy tires of the SUV hummed against the asphalt, a steady vibration that grounded the moment. "You are breathing too fast, Arthur," George said, his voice a low, comforting rumble in the quiet cabin. "You are thinking about the 80,000 people. Do not think about the crowd. A crowd is just a storm of noise, and we have already survived the worst storm this state has to offer. When you walk out there tonight, I do not want you to play for the stadium. I want you to play for Martha. I want you to play for the man you were in the mud, and the man you are sitting here right now. The music is the exact same, whether it is in a dusty living room or the biggest arena in Texas. You just let the wood do the talking." The massive vehicle descended into the concrete bowels of the stadium, navigating the labyrinth of tunnels reserved for the elite. The backstage area was a chaotic symphony of sensory overload. The air was thick with the smell of hot electrical equipment, floor wax, aerosol hairspray, and the palpable electric tension of a massive production about to ignite. Roadies rushed past carrying heavy cables, lighting technicians shouted coordinates into headsets, and security guards stood like stone statues at every corner. For Arthur, it was like stepping onto an alien planet. But wherever George walked, the chaos parted. The crew stopped, nodded respectfully, and made way. They looked at the frail old man walking beside their boss, clutching a guitar case like a shield, and they offered him the exact same reverence. George had made it clear to his entire team, Arthur was not a guest, he was family. They settled into a luxurious dressing room, a quiet oasis away from the roaring machinery of the tour. George's band members, veterans of the road who had seen everything the music industry had to offer, came in one by one. They did not boast or posture. They shook Arthur's hand, asked about the history of his Martin guitar, and spoke to him with the deep unspoken respect that working musicians reserve for those who have truly bled for their craft. Arthur felt a strange, warming sensation spreading through his chest. He was not an outcast here, he was a brother. As the hours ticked by, the muffled roar of the crowd began to bleed through the thick concrete walls. It sounded like a massive, restless ocean, a beast of 80,000 voices waiting to be fed. The opening acts played their sets, the bass vibrating through the floorboards, rattling the ice in the water glasses on the dressing room table. Then the call came. It was time. George stood up, adjusted his belt buckle, and pulled his hat down low over his eyes. He looked at Arthur, who was clutching the scarred Martin guitar, having taken it out of its velvet-lined case. The amber resin filling the cracks caught the harsh fluorescent light of the dressing room, glowing like trapped fire. "Just wait in the wings, my friend," George said, placing a heavy hand on Arthur's shoulder. "When you hear me call your name, you just walk toward the light. I will be right there waiting for you." Arthur nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He followed George out of the dressing room, walking down the long, dark corridor toward the stage. The roar of the crowd grew deafening, a physical force that pressed against his eardrums. He stood behind a massive black curtain, gripping the neck of his guitar so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. Through a gap in the curtain, Arthur watched George Strait take the stage. The arena erupted in a blinding flash of pyrotechnics, and a wall of sound so massive it shook the dust from the rafters. The stage lights swept across the sea of cowboy hats and raised hands. George stepped up to the microphone, strapped on his own guitar, and launched into his set. He was a master commander, steering the massive ship of the arena with effortless grace. He played the hits, the anthems of heartbreak, the celebrations of the Texas lifestyle, and the crowd sang every single word back to him, a choir of 80,000 devoted souls. For an hour, Arthur watched the spectacle, mesmerized by the sheer power of it all. But then the energy in the arena began to shift. The massive backing band quietly unplugged their instruments and slipped away into the shadows. The blinding, colorful stage lights faded to pitch black. A hush fell over the massive stadium, a sudden, heavy silence that felt heavier than the noise. A single, stark white spotlight pierced the darkness, illuminating George Strait sitting on a simple wooden stool in the dead center of the stage. Another empty stool sat right beside him. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that something profoundly different was about to happen. George leaned into the microphone, his face cast in sharp shadows by the solitary beam of light. "Folks," George began, his voice echoing through the massive PA system, wrapping around every single person in the building. We sing a lot of songs about hard times. We sing about broken hearts, empty wallets, and long, lonely roads. But sometimes, the hardest times are not the ones we write songs about. Sometimes the hardest times are the ones that break us so completely, we forget how to make music at all. The stadium was so quiet you could hear the hum of the amplifiers. Arthur's heart leaped into his throat. He leaned closer to the gap in the curtain, his eyes fixed on the man in the spotlight. A few weeks ago, George continued, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre, as if he were sitting around a campfire rather than in the middle of a massive arena. I was driving back home through a storm, the kind of Texas rain that washes out the roads and hides the stars. And out there on the shoulder of a dark highway, I found a man. A good man. A man who had worked his whole life, loved his wife with all his heart, and harmed absolutely no one. But the world can be a cruel place, folks. The world can take a man who is already down and kick him until he cannot breathe. George paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the silent crowd. This man had been thrown out into the freezing rain, and the man who threw him out did not just take his home. He took a heavy work boot and he stomped it straight through an antique Martin guitar. A guitar that was the last living memory of this man's late wife. He smashed it into splinters, and he left that man in the mud to die of a broken heart. A collective gasp rippled through the 80,000 people, a wave of genuine shock and righteous anger. The cruelty of the act, described in such stark, unflinching terms by a man they idolized, struck a deep nerve. But out in West Texas, we do not let the mud have the final say, George said, his voice rising, gathering a fierce, undeniable power. We picked up those pieces, every single splinter, and we put them back together. Because a man's dignity is not something you can just crush under your boot and walk away from. Tonight, I want you to hear the sound of a spirit that refused to stay broken. I want you to hear the sound of true country music. George turned away from the microphone and looked directly toward the dark wings where Arthur was standing. He raised his hand, gesturing into the shadows. Texas, I want you to welcome my friend, Mr. Arthur. The crowd erupted. It was not the wild, screaming frenzy of a pop concert. It was a deep, roaring wave of absolute respect and overwhelming support. The sound hit Arthur like a physical blow, nearly knocking him backward. A stagehand gently touched his back, nudging him forward. Arthur took a deep, shuddering breath, stepped out from behind the black curtain, and walked into the blinding white light. He walked slowly, his new boots echoing softly on the stage floor. He held the scarred Martin guitar across his chest. The massive video screens flanking the stage zoomed in on the instrument. The crowd could see every devastating crack, every jagged line where the wood had been shattered, and they could see the beautiful glowing amber resin that held it all together. They saw the trembling hands of the old man, his eyes wide, shining with unshed tears, as he looked out at the impossible sea of humanity. George stood up, removed his hat, and placed his hand over his heart as Arthur approached. It was a gesture of supreme submission, a king bowing to a commoner, acknowledging that the truest royalty is born from survival. George pulled out the second wooden stool, helping Arthur to sit down. He adjusted a microphone stand, pointing it directly at the sound hole of the battered Martin. Arthur looked at George, panic momentarily flashing across his face. George just smiled, leaned in close and whispered, "Just like on the porch, Arthur. Just you, me, and Martha. Let her sing." George sat back down, strapped on his own guitar, and gave Arthur a subtle nod. Arthur closed his eyes. He blocked out the 80,000 people. He blocked out the blinding lights. He imagined the smell of peach cobbler, the sound of his wife's laughter, and the quiet peace of the ranch porch. He raised his right hand, his arthritic fingers finding their familiar ancient grooves, and he struck the first chord. The sound that exploded through the stadium's massive sound system was nothing short of miraculous. The master luthier's work, combined with the deep, tragic history of the wood, produced a tone that was impossibly rich. It was a dark, resonant, weeping sound, carrying the weight of 100 sorrowful nights and the triumph of a single, glorious dawn. It did not sound like a repaired guitar. It sounded like a resurrected soul. George joined in a second later, his flawless strumming wrapping around Arthur's raw emotional chords. They did not play a fast, upbeat radio hit. They played an old traditional hymn of redemption, a song about wandering through the wilderness and finally seeing the light of home. George leaned into his microphone, his smooth, iconic baritone voice filling the arena, but he kept his volume low, allowing the haunting melody of Arthur's guitar to take the absolute center stage. As the song progressed, Arthur's fear entirely vanished. The trembling in his hands stopped, replaced by a fierce, undeniable strength. He was not just playing the notes, he was pouring decades of love, loss, poverty, and ultimate salvation into every single vibration of the strings. He opened his eyes, looking out at the crowd. He saw grown men in cowboy hats wiping tears from their faces. He saw women holding their hands over their hearts. He saw a massive, unified family sharing in his pain and his healing. When they reached the final chorus, George stepped back from his microphone, gesturing for Arthur to take the lead. Arthur played a complex, beautiful run of notes down the scarred fretboard, a flourish of pure, unadulterated talent that had been hidden in dark corners for far too long. He struck the final, lingering chord, letting the deep vibrations sustain, hanging in the air until it slowly, beautifully faded into silence. For 3 seconds, the stadium was dead quiet, and then the eruption occurred. 80,000 people rose to their feet as one. The roar was deafening, a physical earthquake of applause, cheers, and weeping. They were not cheering for a celebrity, they were cheering for the triumph of the human spirit. They were cheering for the scarred wood and the scarred man who proved that nothing is ever truly beyond repair. George stood up, slung his guitar behind his back, and wrapped his arms around the frail old man, pulling him into a deep, fierce embrace. Arthur buried his face in George's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably, the heavy burden of a lifetime of sorrow finally washing away in a flood of absolute joy. But the impact of that night did not stop at the stadium doors. The moment was captured by tens of thousands of cell phones, the video of the broken man and the scarred guitar spreading across the world like wildfire. It became a testament to kindness, a viral sensation that reached into places far beyond the realm of country music. And it reached a dark, dingy, smoke-filled bar on the outskirts of a forgotten Texas town. The landlord, a bitter man with a heart full of venom, was sitting on a sticky vinyl stool nursing a cheap, warm beer. The bar was nearly empty, the only light coming from a flickering neon sign and the television mounted above the rows of liquor bottles. The local news channel was playing a segment on the concert that had taken the internet by storm. The landlord glanced up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing at the screen. He saw the massive stadium, he saw the famous face of George Strait, and then the camera cut to the old man sitting on the stool. The landlord's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the frail shoulders, he recognized the white hair. And then the camera zoomed in on the guitar. The landlord stared at the jagged, amber-filled cracks running down the mahogany wood. He remembered the sickening crunch his heavy work boot had made when he stomped on it. He remembered the old man crying in the mud. The television volume was low, but the reporter's voice cut through the silence of the bar with devastating clarity, recounting the story George Strait had told the crowd, the story of a cruel, heartless man who had tried to destroy an innocent life. The few other patrons in the bar, rough men with calloused hands, were watching the screen intently. "Can you imagine the kind of absolute monster it takes to do something like that to an old man?" one of the patrons muttered, shaking his head in disgust, stomping on a dead woman's guitar. "A man who does that does not deserve to breathe the same air as the rest of us. If I ever met the coward who did that, I would break his jaw myself." The landlord felt a cold, terrifying sweat break out on the back of his neck. His stomach twisted into a violent knot. He looked around the bar, suddenly feeling entirely exposed, entirely surrounded by the judgment of the world. The crushing weight of his own cruelty crashed down upon him. He had thought he was a powerful man, exerting his authority over a helpless tenant. But looking at the screen, seeing the glorious redemption of the man he had broken, the landlord realized the horrifying truth. He was not powerful. He was a pathetic, small, wretched creature, and his sin was now broadcast for the entire world to see. He dropped a crumpled bill on the sticky counter and practically ran out into the dark night, the phantom sound of 80,000 people cheering for his victim ringing in his ears, a haunting melody of guilt he would never, ever escape. Meanwhile, behind the closed doors of his ranch, George Strait was ensuring that Arthur's fairy tale ending was bound in ironclad reality. George did not just give the old man a moment of glory and send him on his way. He sat down with his team of high-powered lawyers and accountants, setting up a specialized trust fund. He mandated that every single penny of the royalties from the live recording of that duet, a track that was rapidly climbing to the top of the charts worldwide, would go directly into the Arthur's Melody Trust. George used the initial surge of funds to purchase a beautiful, modest little house on a quiet tree-lined street in a peaceful Texas town. It had a wide wraparound porch, perfect for sitting in a rocking chair and watching the sunset. He furnished it completely, stocked the pantry, and handed Arthur the deed free and clear, ensuring the old man would never have to worry about a landlord, a rent check, or a cold night ever again. Arthur spent the final years of his life in absolute peace. He became a beloved figure in his new community. Neighbors would often gather on his front lawn on warm summer evenings, bringing pitchers of sweet tea and folding chairs just to sit and listen to the old man play the scarred Martin guitar on his porch. He played the songs of his youth, he played the hymns of his salvation, and he always played a special tune for his Martha. He was no longer a broken man in the mud. He was a beacon of light, a living testament to the grace of God and the kindness of a stranger. When Arthur finally passed away, many years later, he went peacefully in his sleep, a gentle smile on his face, in the warm, safe bed of the home his music had brought him. George Strait attended the small, private funeral, standing quietly in the back, his hat held respectfully over his heart, shedding a silent tear for the friend he had found in the storm. But the story of the scarred wood did not end in the ground. Years later, in the heart of Nashville, Tennessee, the Country Music Hall of Fame stands as a monument to the legends of the genre. Tourists from all over the globe walk the polished hardwood floors, staring in awe at the sequined suits, the handwritten lyrics, and the platinum records of the greatest stars who ever lived. In the very center of the main exhibition hall, bathed in a soft, respectful light, stands a single freestanding glass case. It does not contain a rhinestone jacket or a diamond-studded microphone. Resting on a bed of deep crimson velvet is a vintage Martin acoustic guitar. The wood is heavily scarred, the massive cracks running through the body filled with a beautiful, glowing amber resin. It is a stunning piece of art, a physical manifestation of trauma and healing. People stop and stare at it, captivated by the visible history etched into the instrument. They lean in to read the small, solid brass plaque mounted at the base of the glass case. The plaque does not mention the number of records George Strait sold. It does not list his awards or his stadium tours. The brass plaque simply reads Arthur's guitar, rescued from the rain, played with the soul. A reminder that the truest measure of a legend is not found in the roar of a stadium, but in the willingness to step down into the mud, to dirty your hands, and to carefully, lovingly put the broken pieces of a fellow human being back together. For music is just sound until it is used to heal a shattered heart.